Hello, everyone. Over the next 4 weeks, we will be dropping a special episode of the Job Hunting Podcast from our 2022 collection into your feed. We're doing this because we believe these episodes are great for this time of the year. Sometimes, even as we are recording and editing them, we earmark them for the festive season. Secondly, we believe in repetition. I have often listened to podcast episodes 2 or 3 times to let the message sink in. If you have already listened to these episodes before, my advice is to listen again, and you will uncover a few more gems and great advice from them. And finally, we do this because we as a team need to take a break, but we don't want to leave you hanging. You see, festive seasons can be triggering to job hunters. It can make you feel more stressed and lonely in your job search. I remember this very well because I've been there and I don't want you to feel like I did. So for me, keeping the podcast and my newsletter going out weekly is incredibly important and is part of the support system that I provide for you. Many people ask me, should I keep looking for work during the holidays? Or should I just give up and start again, let's say at the end of January? My answer is always, it depends. If you are looking for work now, my message to you is keep looking. There will be less competition, even though fewer roles are usually advertised around this time. I do think it's still a good thing to keep looking and keep the momentum going and build yourself a job hunting discipline, even if you're doing just one small task per day. To learn how to best organize your schedule to fit job hunting in your daily and weekly routine, you can download my free resource. It's called the Optimized Job Search. You can find it on my website, renatabernardi.com. That's RENATABERNARDE.com. There's also a link to it in this episode's show notes. Remember, I am with you. You should carry on, and the newsletters and podcasts are here to provide you with accountability, knowledge, and support. Now, let's listen to this episode. Hi, I'm Renata Bernardi, and this is the Job Hunting Podcast, where I interview experts and professionals and discuss issues that are important for job hunters and those who are working to advance their careers. So make sure that you subscribe and follow, and let's dive right in. There's nothing like learning from the expert. And our guest today, Ginny Clarke, has extensive experience recruiting senior leaders for some of the most sought-after employers in the US. Given we had her for a whole hour for this episode, I collated a range of questions from listeners, from you, and also from clients. And I asked Ginny those questions. So listen to this episode if you want to learn how to answer the infamous question about the salary, if you've wondered if you could apply multiple times for the same organization, if you need to explain a career gap, if you're worried about your references, and much more. Ginny was most recently Director Executive Recruiting at Google from 2016 until end of 2020. In this role, she led the diversity, non-tech recruiting, and leadership internal mobility teams. Before Google, Ginny was a partner at Spencer Stuart, one of the most highly sought-after global executive search firms, where she co-founded and led the firm's global diversity practice. Currently, Ginny now has her own talent and leadership consulting business. She is also an active keynote speaker, host, and has a podcast called The Fifth Dimensional Leadership, and you should go and listen to it. She's also the author of Career Mapping, Charting Your Course in the New World of Work. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Ginny. I really enjoyed chatting with her. This podcast is such a wonderful opportunity for me to catch up with recruiters and experts all over the world, and it's my pleasure to share those conversations with you. Have a great time listening to the 7 job search questions answered by an executive recruiter, Ginny Clarke.
So you're in Chicago.
Yeah.
And you've lived everywhere.
Did you, or are you working from Chicago at Google?
No, I lived in California when I was at Google, but I was born and raised in Southern California. And so when I went to Google, my son had been in college out there for a couple of years. And so I was closer to him. I was still 500 miles away, but closer. I was in the same state. So that made it nice.
It's a very long state. So
Very long state. People think, somebody said to me, I'm going to be in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
Is that close to you? I'm like 500 miles away. No, I mean, look at a map. Come on. Oh,
I know. I remember I've done the Highway 1 trip a few times.
so pretty.
It's so pretty, isn't it? And one of these times was for my honeymoon. So we started in San Diego, and my husband forgot his glasses in San Diego, and we have reached Santa Barbara. And he's like, I need to go back. And I'm like, please don't. And we did. We went back to San Diego.
What was that? 4 or 5 hours?
I don't know. It
That's a
was
long way.
20, oh my gosh, 30 years ago. But yeah, I was very annoyed with him.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, I would have
but
been too. But what are you gonna
anyway,
do?
and now you're in Chicago. What took you to Chicago?
Well, I was originally here for graduate school in the 80s, and that's why I
Went
moved here
to
to go to Kellogg.
Northwestern.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then I had most of my career here until Google called, and I kind of went, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't. Most people like, oh, Google, and I was kind of like, eh. I mean, I was in my 50s at that point. It's like, but I figured if I could help them with diversity in particular, that was part of the expertise that they wanted me to help with.
Has been a big hallmark of your career to help organizations implement. I mean, I read your bio and it shows that you co-founded the diversity at
Spencer Stewart.
That's fantastic. And that was early days of diversity.
It was. Yeah.
But were we already using the word diversity?
Yeah.
How sometimes we get used to words and it's only been a minute.
Well, and then to me, and we can get into this if you want, but now it feels almost, dare I say, comical that, we still haven't solved it, and yet we just keep adding all these words. It's, it's inclusion, it's belonging, it's justice, it's this. It should be all of that, yes, but, adding more words to the acronym isn't making it any better.
So tell us, let's tell the listeners a little bit more about your career.
Sure.
What happened at Northwestern that made you decide to, go into HR? Was it at that stage?
Oh, no, I never, and I still in many ways don't consider myself to be an HR, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
I'll go back just because I think it's interesting I often want to share this part about my interests early on because I've had a very nonlinear career. So I went to University of California, Davis undergrad because I wanted to be a veterinarian. And I had gone to University of California, Riverside in my hometown so that I could get in and study animal science and become a veterinarian. Well, after 2 quarters, I just hated it, changed majors to French and linguistics, double major.
That's a big change.
Big change, but I'd studied French all through high school. I had a great French teacher. And I loved language. I knew I didn't want to be a language teacher, be an interpreter, anything. I knew that. But I loved the fact that it was a system. And I learned many years later that I'm a systems thinker. So I worked for a couple of years as a recruiter for the University of California, and then decided to go to business school and chose Northwestern. I only picked 3 schools and got into Northwestern. And it was just the best thing ever.
And you did what was it, an MBA?
MBA. Yeah. Yeah. And it was great. Oh, well, I mean,
love Northwestern. They still have blackboards. Can you believe it? Like, you go there now. I love it.
I haven't seen any, and I was up recently. I'm still very active there. And in fact, I just interviewed the current dean, a woman, who is going to be a guest on my podcast that launches tomorrow. Shameless plug. But I've just always had an affinity for that school. And I worked as a recruiter for them part-time as a student and got my MBA. And I wanted to, my focus was accounting and finance. That's where I thought I was going to head. And I realized that the similarity, the linkage was that systems thinking. Accounting is the language of business, right? And I had studied language. So that's kind of how I thought about it. And I went into banking. They were recruiting because I didn't want to be an accountant. That much I knew. But I started in banking at First National Bank of Chicago, which became Chase. And then I moved into commercial real estate for several years with what's now called Jones Lang LaSalle. It used to be LaSalle Partners. And then I moved on to Prudential Real Estate Investors. And then I decided my father passed away. And it was that seminal moment when I thought, I don't love this anymore. What have I always loved? And it was recruiting. And so I networked my way into one of the world's largest executive search firms and was there for 12
Right.
years.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And now after that, you decided recruiting was a passion.
Hmm.
You stayed there, you moved to, I think, LHH, and then
That's right.
what in-house with Google. What happened in 2020 that made you decide, okay,
Well,
I want
before we
to
go
go
there, there was another little gap there where I left Spencer Stewart after I'd made partner and it continued on for several years to write a book. So I wrote a
Oh,
book called Career Mapping during that time in 2011 and
yeah.
did consulting and speaking and all of that on career management because of what I had learned. And I tried to put together this framework because I'd seen so many people inside of a search firm who came to me and said, "You're going to help me find my next job." And I thought, probably not. Well, because you understand how that works, right? Search
Yeah.
firms are not working for the person, they're working for
Yeah.
the company that's hiring. And so the likelihood that I would have that perfect job for that person I was speaking to was very, very low. And I thought about it and I was like, that's not a good strategy for the individual. You should be more deliberate about what you want
You're
because I always
correct.
believe that you can create what you want. You
Mm.
shouldn't just wait for the phone to ring. Right?
Yes,
That
you
was
were
the other
correct.
thing before I went back into search because I'm single mom, wanted to get on a regular cadence of of revenue. And so, yeah, that was when Google called. I had met someone who had gone to Google after the firm that we worked for
Mhm.
sold,
Mhm.
and a guy named Stuart Kaplan. And he said, we need help specifically with diversity at the executive recruiting level. And
Wow.
I kind of went, do I want to do that? I don't know. But if I can crack the code, then it would help change,
Yeah.
Google sets the tone for the entire industry,
Of
right?
course.
So if I could help do that, that was the objective in going there. And I was there for
Mhm.
about 4.5 years. In 2020, when I left, it just got I was tired.
Mm.
So many things that happened. I had 3 different teams while I was there. I started out with diversity, and then I added internal mobility, and then this was simultaneously. So I had 3
Yeah.
concurrent teams, 30 people. Then I had the team of recruiters as well. And there was always sort of a reorg and a change. And I finally said, I don't think I can be effective under these conditions. And so I decided just to say, good
Yeah.
luck. Love y'all. I gotta go.
When you left, your career and mine has so many similarities. We could
Mm,
go on and have a whole episode just about that.
uh-huh.
When you left, did you know that you wanted to work for yourself again?
I did,
You
yes.
did.
I
Okay.
did. And I had been working with a speaking coach, interestingly. It was funny because during my time at Google, word got out that I had written this book on career management, not to mention the fact that I had created an internal mobility program for the senior leaders, still sitting inside of the executive recruiting function. And the whole idea of that was to the extent that we can help retain some of the top talent, not determined by me, but by, the hiring managers,
Yes.
then we could, that's what everybody wants to do. That's what you retain top talent. And so
Yes.
the program was really focused on how do we help some of these leaders because there aren't going to be other senior level jobs that are going to meet their professional needs necessarily, which is why they might have been looking outside. Can
Mhm.
we help create new opportunities within Google for some of these senior folks? And so my team and I worked with them, kind of coached them on what are your competencies? And that's a word that you hear me say a lot because
Okay.
that to me is the essence of what people need to understand about what they're bringing. It's not just what you've done, it's how you've done it. And how can you port some of these competencies? They are skills and capabilities and indicative demonstrated behaviors surrounding potential, yes,
Yes.
but how can you as an individual say, well, I've done all these things, I've deconstructed these activities and capabilities from different jobs, and
Mhm.
now I'd like to rebundle them, repackage them into something else. And I think there's so much power for an individual to be able to do that. So that's what I did. Anyway, back to, just back to me,
Yeah.
the word got out that I had this book and that I was really good at internal mobility and talking about careers. And so I ended up speaking to a lot of employee resource groups, ERGs within Google, for women and people of color, and for different functional groups that might have a summit. And so I thought, wow, I probably spoke to about 4 or 5,000 Googlers during my time.
Wow.
And I thought, well, I would love to be able to do this and take it to the next level as a professional speaker. And so that's mostly how I'm spending my time these days. I work through a speakers bureau, and I've been booked quite a number of times in the last year.
Oh, awesome. Have
Yeah.
you been doing live events or has it been
Live.
more?
Yeah, I did. Initially
Oh,
it was virtual, but now I'm doing live. I travel, 2 or 3 or 4 times a month to different destinations. And it's a lot of, what would I call them? Trade associations and other professional associations. It's
okay.
just been a lot of fun. But I've expanded my repertoire to talk mostly about leadership, which is
Oh,
what
wow.
I observed while at Google and during all those years as an executive recruiter.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's fantastic. In fact, I wanted to use your time on this podcast to answer some of the questions that I get,
Yeah, of
because
course.
that in-house experience that you have, and
Mhm.
together with the external executive search that you've done, I think gives the listeners such great insight on
Sure.
what they need to do. A couple of reflections on what you've said so far. You wrote a book quite a while ago, and still, this misunderstanding of the different roles between, somebody that can coach or mentor you, or somebody that can, that you go to when there's a job opportunity, when they have a briefing that suits you,
Mhm.
which is the executive search role. People don't really understand the
No.
difference. In fact, yesterday I did a StreamYard, but I did it live on LinkedIn, YouTube,
I
and
saw that.
you saw that,
Yes.
with 2 executive search partners trying to workshop, how can we educate their candidates, my listeners, on being better prepared when they reach out to recruiters.
Yes.
And even though you like to position that difference between exec search and, normal recruitment, to me, it doesn't really matter. I think that career readiness, you need to learn from the get-go,
Oh, for sure.
even though there is a level of sophistication when you become more senior.
Mhm.
There's still an etiquette about it that it's better, as soon as possible. It's really interesting. I am specializing in more mature clients. So my clientele is, I kid you not, I have a client in his 70s.
I love
I
it.
have clients in their 60s and 50s and 40s. And I have one client in her 30s, just one. So that shows, that there is this really interesting second half of the career tail
Yeah.
end kind of focus of my work. But I've just finished teaching at university,
Terrific.
160 students, and doing masters of public policy, international relations, international development. So a whole bunch of master students, a bit older, in their late 20s, early 30s, some are older than that. But it's interesting that their questions and the things that I teach and the roadmap that I created as a coach, I mean, you developed a framework. Each coach, loves
Yep.
to their own framework. I can apply it to, a wide range of clients and
Mhm.
students. That's really, I think, important. Would you imagine somebody going into sports or acting without knowing what their competencies were? Like yes, I have a strong backhand, or no, I don't have a strong backhand.
Right.
That's not my forte. Let's avoid that on the field. Like
Exactly.
you have to know, and I think that education is still missing, even
Mhm.
from amazing universities like Northwestern. I remember I visited the MBA team there back in 2008, and they had an amazing career coach there.
Mhm.
For what name, she's now not at what Northwestern. So if anybody's looking for a career coach in Chicago, you can try to find her. I will remember her name and add to the episode show notes. And she taught me so much.
Mhm.
I think that if you are smart while you're doing your professional development and you reach out to the teams in universities and business schools, they can
Mhm.
help so much. But not a lot of people reach out to them.
Not until they need a job, and
No,
and at that point, you're not really paying attention
no,
to some of the underlying reasons that
exactly.
might
I
have.
got a
So
feedback on the name of my podcast. It's called the Job Hunting Podcast. And
Mhm.
somebody wrote to me and said, I know it's called the Job Hunting Podcast, but I wish I was listening to this before I lost my job. not now.
Yeah.
That's amazing that it's 2022 and now it seems that there is an awakening of personal values and alignment, ambitions. Is this really my ambition to work at Tesla? If
Mhm.
I have to work there, in loco at the office, I don't want anymore. I've changed my ambition to the point I don't care what my CEO says. I want to stay
Mhm.
home. I think people are really starting to reassess their values,
Indeed. I think that's a good thing. Mhm.
isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. So now let's work on answering some questions from my audience.
Yeah.
These are questions I literally went back and found them, in notes and things like that. And the salary conversation is one that comes up time and time again.
Mhm.
Now, because of the ATS systems, it's sometimes unavoidable if you hop online, even as a more senior candidate. Is it true that organizations like Google would still recruit senior candidates through an online system, or is it still
Could be.
could
It
be, isn't
depends on the level. If you're senior, if you're talking age or level,
it?
right?
Yeah,
At a
it's level.
certain, and that's why I was saying at a certain level, director level and up, we generally didn't take applicants. We weren't using the applicant tracking system. It
Right.
was it was treated like an executive search firm. So we were
Okay.
going out, these were passive candidates. We went out and had recruiters who were identifying these folks and considered some internal candidates as well. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's why it's real different.
All right. But how do you address the salary conversation,
The
Jenny?
salary piece very often, and it depends on there are laws and I think they
Mhm.
emerge in certain states as a function of gender pay inequity where you can't ask.
Mhm.
So if you're not, you need to know the laws for wherever you might be going because you shouldn't have to share it. You want to know that there will be parity between you and someone else, regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender, whatever, race, all these things, because there's a lot of disparity around compensation. So that's why those laws have been put in place in certain countries. If you're asked, I would just give a range and I would actually try to offer this is where I want to be because this is where I know the market is,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of women have been underpaid, chronically underpaid, and so they're not even at market.
Mm.
So the answer should be this is what I know the market is. If they insist and want to see tax returns or something, well, you're stuck. Tell the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
But also I would follow it quickly with, but this is what I know the market to be, and this is where I would expect you to come in.
I agree. And I think as part of your research, if you are a candidate, if you are job hunting, you really need to know what the market's
Ask
paying. And
people.
some
Yeah.
people ask
Yeah.
people, some people feel very awkward about asking
Yeah.
about salaries. Since you mentioned women listening to this episode, go to A Career That Soars. It's a subscription membership for ambitious women, and you can ask anything on that platform. It's run by 3 amazing women,
Mhm.
and I think they have hundreds of women now on the platform. And you can use Reddit, Glassdoor, talk to
Glassdoor.
people, but definitely find out. I think it's important that you know what you should be paid
That's right.
before you go to market.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unavoidable, that question these days, and knowing gives you power.
Mhm.
Now, how about recently had a client in the US who applied for a job at Google at the director level, and then nothing happened. We analyzed the resume again. It was a perfect position for her, by the way, but we analyzed it again on using JobScan to make sure the ATS was working on her favor. We fixed a few things. There's another role at Google, right? We want to reapply. A lot of times people ask me, what happens when you apply multiple times with the same organization? This is not more exec search, it's more like recruitment, but I was hoping you could give insight if there is, like, some people think that there's a black mark against their name.
No, of
think
course not.
that's all
No.
folklore, don't you think?
There's not a black mark per se against someone. I mean, if you see someone just keeps applying and applying and applying and being rejected, then you got to wonder what's wrong. But if they've been reviewed and someone has reached out and expressed interest and they were considered, whether or not they were eventually interviewed, right? That if they got a response that said we're interested and at least a recruiter had a conversation with them to know something about them, that information gets captured. And so they'll often be considered again because there's some reference points. But
Agree.
no, that shouldn't
Yeah.
be, you shouldn't run
I
away.
think if somebody is applying, and not getting through, there's a tendency to blame the organization and say, "Oh, I've been black marked. I bet there's something, in the system."
Well,
But
you know
most
what? In that instance, move on. Move on.
likely,
Look at another company, find another way. Knowing someone can help, right?
yeah,
If you know someone inside to be able to say, this is a role that I'm interested in. Do you know anybody in recruiting who might be able to look at my background? Right?
mhm,
To me, that can be advantageous. It's not always going to work in
yeah,
enormous organizations like a Google,
yeah,
but for smaller organizations in particular, if you've got someone who can give you some insight and maybe put in a good word for you, that can help.
yeah. And also, instead of that blame game, look at your application, review it.
Well, yeah, but at some point,
Yeah.
and this is my gripe with the process. There are
Mhm,
people, these algorithms will spit out people who are highly qualified in a different sense, because if you're only looking at experience, and this is
mhm,
why I spent so much time talking about competencies, particularly in the context of trying to increase the number of underrepresented people, right? So there's this whole repeated thing. We know that women have been underpaid, underleveled, chronic. We know that. And I'm talking a lot about
mhm.
women just because there isn't parity, at least not in the United States, there isn't, right?
No, and
And so
here's the
we
thing.
we know that, and
Mhm,
yet we'll still look at a woman's everybody's can be accused of having done it. We'll look at that resume and still go, well, they haven't done this and they haven't done that. And my attitude is, but have you had a conversation with them to understand the depth of what they actually know? Because if
agree.
they've been underleveled, then
Yes.
you're not seeing the full range of capabilities. And that's why competencies are not the same as experience. And, that's why I was trained to know how to interview for competencies and
Um,
not just check the box and say they've done this, they have this title, that means nothing. I've worked with plenty of incompetent people who had beautiful resumes, and I brought in people who had not so great looking resumes, but when I met them, and often it was based on a referral, they were amazing.
I
Which
love
one do you want?
Yeah, it's really funny. I don't say this to clients, but now that I'm here with you, I'll say this. A lot of men since the beginning of the pandemic has had a very patchy career.
Yeah,
They lost their jobs. They got a contract for 6 months. They, became unemployed for quite a while, got another little job. They worry about it so much. And I want to say, well, welcome to my world. That's
yeah,
the world of women. We
it
go into
is.
maternity leave, we come back, and it's that level of anxiety that women often have about
That's
their
right.
careers not being linear as, compared to men's careers. Now men are starting to experience that more and more.
Mhm, mhm.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, they
Mhm.
have to learn how to talk about the gaps.
Yeah.
There's a way to do it.
Yes, absolutely. I love that as part of your job at Google was to attract but also maintain talent in-house and
Mhm.
try to find opportunities for them. That internal candidate applying for roles and going through promotions, give me an insight of what you need to showcase to be considered for internal opportunities.
It's not easy because
Mhm.
if you're talking about somebody who's been doing one thing for, let's say, 10 or 15 years inside the company or maybe outside, maybe they have 5 years someplace else, 5 years within the organization. The onus falls on them to be able to explain to a hiring manager who might be in a completely different group or function
Mhm.
why this individual has not just functional or domain expertise, but some of the leadership competencies to be able to lead and manage others in this area. Because a smart hiring manager will say, wow, I'll take a proven leader over a domain expert in certain circumstances, right? If I'm trying to really build something, the team can support the domain expertise. They can help that person learn the business. But strong leadership is something that's completely different. It can be different sets of competencies. And unfortunately, I think most companies don't make that distinction, and they promote people based on tenure and based on experience and not based on separate competencies, leadership behaviors versus knowing the business. Those can be two completely different things.
As somebody who was trying to retain talent and support them, what sort of internal professional development you think you can put in place in organizations that helps?
Yeah, Google had pretty hearty learning and development organization. I'm forgetting exactly what they called it. And they have something called Google School for Leaders. And I was a director there, so I benefited from some of the leadership programs that were offered. And I think those things are important because people need to realize that you never stop learning no matter how senior you become. And there's an expectation that, you get around other people who are trying to learn some of these leadership competencies, because again, it's acknowledging the difference between, you might be tenured and an expert, but that doesn't mean you lead effectively. And that's what the promotion is supposed to be about. Moving up the food chain ostensibly means that you're gaining a level of mastery around leading others, right? That's why you move up, you make more money, you have more and more people reporting to you because you're an effective leader. That's the premise. That's not always what happens.
Yeah. It's a hard thing to move away from being so good at what you do to being uncomfortable with, the next level up.
That's
and
right.
Managing, spending so much of your time not doing those things that you were good at, but letting others do it for you.
You have to. That's exactly right. And some people aren't good at that, right? They'll micromanage, or, they don't want to spend time. I think it was Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, who said something like, if you're not spending half your time on people issues, you shouldn't call yourself a leader. That's what leadership is about. You're dealing with people. You're not doing the work, right? Nor are you necessarily overseeing it. That could be a manager, but as the leader, you're setting strategy, you're setting vision, you're making sure that everybody, and you're communicating effectively. Those are leadership competencies.
Yeah, no, that's gold. And Jenny, I think I missed an opportunity to expand on what you said before about the career gap, and how to explain career gaps.
Yeah.
You may have had people come to you and had to explain their career gaps. How open do you think employers are now to career gaps? And career gaps these days, I mean, as a coach, I'm seeing people needing time out for mental health
Yes, absolutely.
or carers reasons,
Yep.
or, in the old days, it would be just maternity leave and a couple of other things. And also because during the pandemic, there were no jobs. If a senior exec would normally take 6 months to a year to find a new role, now it's taking longer because of the fact that, there was no jobs advertised in 2020, early 2021. Do you think there's a more understanding now, or are people still very
Oh, for sure. Oh, I think there's greater understanding. At the same time, I think the individual has to really get comfortable in talking about why there's a leave and not allow themselves to feel a sense of shame and apologize for it, which I think has been the tendency. It's kind of like, well, what can I say? And to be honest, there's a fine line that you don't want to cross where you're sharing too much information.
Yeah.
But to say, I had a sick parent. If that's true, then say that. Who can't relate to that?
Yeah.
Just be sure you tell the truth, right? It's not like somebody's going to go check up on you, but you just never know who knows who. You don't ever want to lie when it comes to anything about your background. So tell the truth, and you can just stop short of something that might be a little bit too personal.
Yes.
Right. And people aren't going to probe if they know it was a family consideration. You don't need to say mental health. You can say health, right? Because there's still some people who have associated stigma with that, in spite of how much we're learning about mental health. In spite of, I saw a statistic recently that said that 84% of, and this was in the US, I believe, 84% of employees and executives are suffering from fatigue and poor mental health. This is a month ago.
There's an amazing number of C-level executives resigning. I don't know if you've seen that in the news. Here in Australia, we've seen it a lot. And I've read some articles from the UK as well.
People are stressed out. So, I think it's becoming a little bit more in vogue to acknowledge that you've succumbed to stress.
Yeah. And look, this has been happening for a long time. My
Of
dad,
course.
we lived in the Valley, by the way. My dad worked in Palo Alto for a
Okay.
while.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then we went back to Brazil. And I don't know exactly when it was. It was before or after our time in the US. But he had to fire 400 people.
Whoa.
And you know those restructures in the 80s, those little
Yes,
really
of course.
hardcore stuff.
Yeah.
And he did that, and then he didn't go back to work, and he couldn't work for an entire year. In fact, the only reason why Dad, I think, got out of his, mental health issues at the time, we didn't call it that,
No.
sure, but I decided I didn't want to go to school. And then he said that was what made him think, okay, I need to go back to work because I'm setting a bad example here to my
Mhm.
children.
Mhm.
But, back then it was really, I don't know how, I actually need to ask him. I don't know how he explained it.
Right.
It's not something that we talk about,
No.
and, people seem to think that now we're all fragile and we have PTSDs and this and that. I'm like, no, mate, we've been having this all the time. It's just
Indeed.
we don't talk about it, right?
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So career gaps, something that I help clients all the time as well. And they're still very uncomfortable about talking about
You just got to get comfortable, practice it.
agree.
You know, I talk in terms of a narrative and telling your whole story in a way you can give the highlights in 10 minutes, right? And that's often what I would do when I would interview candidates. I would have a 90-minute interview with executive candidates, and I would say, tell me your story. And they're like, well, what do you mean? It's all on the resume. I'm like, actually, no, I read it, but there's a lot that's not on the resume. I want to hear your story.
Of
And
course.
in that story, that's where you can weave in, and then you're giving it context versus
Yeah.
just saying, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I did that. It's like, but why did you do those things? What was your motivation for making that move? Did you choose to leave? Why did you choose to leave? Okay. And no judgment, right? So when you begin to hear yourself tell the story, now it doesn't sound so horrible. And you don't have to kind of mumble and cover your mouth and say, I got laid off. Well, there's no stigma against getting laid off anymore. You know what would impress me is if someone said, I was fired.
Mhm.
I was fired because I wasn't performing well enough compared to somebody else in the organization. That would
Ginny,
impress me.
I agree. I have an interview on this podcast with my friend Sasha Kaufman, and you're a speaker now. He used to come to my events as a speaker since 2008 because of his amazing story of being fired, coming back from the ashes, and using that as part of his pitch and the way that he presented himself. Because of that huge failure, I've learned to do this, to do that.
There you go.
And I think that is such a great way of addressing the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially in a small town like Melbourne, I mean, people that live here doesn't think it's small, but it's a much smaller, business community than, let's say, Chicago, right?
Sure.
So it's better that you address that because
Absolutely.
you are controlling the narrative,
Precisely.
letting others make their assumptions about you.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's really good. In terms of storytelling, I think that you were saying before that you're now a speaker and you're part of a bureau. I will put a link in the show notes about that. There is such a great opportunity for executives to become better storytellers. And we've been talking about this for years. Part of my program is, teaching people how to tell stories. We go to Roland Barthes and Aristotle's, and we look at, how movies are put together. All movies have failures built in, like those things that get your attention, and you are then paying more attention, not because everything is smooth and pretty and perfect. No story is fun if it's written like that.
That's right.
Right?
It's not real. I mean, it's kind of the hero's journey, right? I mean, Joseph Campbell was known for writing that. And the hero always goes through ups and downs. And what did you learn? That's always what I want to hear about.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that. I'd love to talk to you about references. I do something quite different. I add 2 references to my resumes at the
Mhm.
bottom, and I say contact details upon request, but I add the names. The reason why I do this, and I know a lot of people don't, I want to get your views, is because I was new to this country when I first came here and I didn't know anybody. And having 2 people in Australia that could, or, it could be overseas, but 2 people that could vouch for me, that had my back, that could advocate for me when the time was right, was important for the recruiter to know or the hiring manager to know.
Yep.
And I add those 2 references to all my resumes, and my clients tend to convert. So I think that there's something about that.
Mhm.
What do you think?
I mean, I'm used to taking references on candidates regularly. Being in-house is different from being in an agency
Yeah.
for these executive roles that I'm familiar with. So being in-house, legal would not allow us to reach out to anybody
Oh,
whose
of
name
course.
was not given to us by the candidate.
Oh, okay.
So they had to give us their list of references when we got to that point in the process. And those
Yeah.
are the only people we could call.
Yeah.
We often would have hiring managers who said, well, I know so-and-so, and let me go ask them. And it's like, no. Do you realize that you could be compromising this person? They were usually still employed, right? And I've heard of horror stories where somebody just thought they were asking their buddy, and it turns out, well, their buddy was the person's boss, right?
Yes.
Or used to be or something. It's just so you never, ever want to do that.
Yeah.
Being in an agency, however, at Spencer Stewart, we were able to do what we called sometimes third-party referencing.
Yes.
So we would reach out to those people because we had a robust database. You could substitute LinkedIn these days. You can kind of
Yes.
see who are they connected to and ask around that way. But again, word gets around that you're asking around about
Yes.
someone. So as a recruiter, you have to maintain your integrity and respect the confidentiality of the references that were given.
Yeah.
But we were able to often, because of the robustness of the database, find at least one person who knew this individual because they might have worked in the same organization, for a period of time, and they could give us some additional, hopefully unbiased feedback on them in addition to the names that the candidate would have given us. But make sure that you're giving names of people who worked with you, not just friends, right? They can really attest with some specificity what it is that you're good at. Make sure that it's not too much time has lapsed. 10 years ago, you're a different person. That's not going to be a great reference. Go for people who actually worked with you and know you. Ideally, it's someone who's been a direct report, someone who might have been a boss, and someone who's a peer.
Ginny, what happens when your immediate manager in your most recent job is not somebody you got along with? You left at odds with that manager. Many jobs require the future employer to do the due diligence and talk to the previous manager.
Yeah, this is where I think, employment laws are real different too, country by country, because
Yes.
a lot of times most people in the States, most individuals would not talk to a recruiter, right? So your boss wouldn't, they're not even allowed. You have to call into HR and they're not going to put you through to whoever that person was. Now, if you know the name of the individual and you can reach them yourself, well, to the extent that the candidate didn't give you his or her name, that's not totally cool, right? Because there are 2 sides of the story. It could be that that person is a terrible leader and manager and your candidate is great.
Yeah.
Or it could, there's the truth lies somewhere in between. So
Yeah.
you really got to be careful when you're doing these. But the recruiter needs to be careful. The candidate needs to be careful.
Yes. In talking about being careful, what do you think about social media activity when you're going into recruitment? I've had some conversations recently, and this was a really interesting case study where it wasn't the client that reached out to me that was looking for work. It was his partner, but they were in conflict because his partner was in a very traditional work environment. And this client of mine, social media was not very conservative.
Oh.
And, and his partner was saying, this is not going to help my career. I'm very ambitious for my career. In the end, this was a couple of years ago. They're not together anymore. And I wonder, if social media and that discrepancy between one wanting to become to be private and keep things private, and the other one wanting to have a very public lifestyle
Yeah.
was
Well,
problematic.
social media, you're putting yourself on Front Street. So, I would tell my son and everybody else, it's like, what do you want people to see? Whether or not you're connected, other people can see into your behaviors. And so if you're hanging out on a beach all the time, I have a friend who, God love her, I mean, she's on social media constantly and she has a pretty good, relatively senior level job. But one time I said to her, I always see you just out to dinner with your girls on the weekends and on vacation. And when do you work? When do you, I mean, it's like at some point you're not sending, at least show yourself at an event. I'm not big on social media, but I showed myself at a speaking thing with some of the other attendees. Me eating dinner night after night, that's not interesting, or hanging out with my friends. So if anything, I'm trying to demonstrate that I'm a well-rounded person with varied interests, but I don't always need to have a drink in my hand. I mean, it's a little bit of common sense. And this isn't even about conservatism. Forget about, now that's a whole nother conversation. When you're
Yes.
putting your views out there, you're really asking for it. Whichever way you want to go, just be careful, because not everybody's going to agree with you. And some organizations don't want to be caught in the middle of having, particularly a very senior level person having strong political views. So be careful. This
Yeah.
is my best advice. Tone it
It-
down just to be safe.
I think I'd like to reflect on this, because I think it's important for people to, again, with a coach or doing some self-reflection, understand that they have a reputation.
Whether or
Regardless,
not you
whether
are,
or not you like it,
that's it. You will
it's
have a
there.
reputation.
But
Yes.
you
And do
will
you
have
know
a
what it is? Becomes the
Exactly.
question. Yes.
One of the hardest works that I do as a coach is increase equity in that reputation. If you burnt bridges, if you haven't really taken care of it and nurtured it, and people don't know what to think about you, or they, I had a conversation with a client yesterday, and she's like, I've just realized people think of me as Y, and I'm not Y, I'm X. I need to change their perception. How do I do it? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, let's work on it. It doesn't happen overnight,
No.
because you need that ongoing PR. That's why organizations have PR, public relations. You need the ongoing, consistent messaging over
Yep,
time. And
that's
if
right.
you are ongoing, consistent messaging that you're out and about having drinks all night,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you aren't, if that's what you're posting, that's what people are seeing,
That's right.
then you are sending that message. So think about the branding and how it will stick, what equity you will have in your reputation as a senior executive or professional, whatever level you are.
Exactly.
And it needs to be consistent. So when I work with clients, it's like everything needs to be consistent. It's not perfect. It's just consistent messaging.
Yeah.
The message on LinkedIn, the message on your resume, what comes out of your mouth when you're on a phone screen or at an interview.
What is your story? What's your narrative? How do you talk about yourself? Yes.
So consistent. And social media is part of that.
Absolutely.
Isn't it amazing what LinkedIn has done to recruitment and selection?
Yeah. I mean, I was around at Spencer Stewart before it existed, right? So it was a very new thing, but I think it's a really fabulous tool that it's opened up a whole market for employers and for would-be employees too, for candidates.
What do you think about LinkedIn as a tool to overcome some issues like with diversity and inclusion? Do you think that that's possible as well?
Yeah,
Through that?
I think it has.
Yeah.
Yeah. And frankly, I'm an African American woman. I'm very fair skinned. People don't always know that, but there are things that I have in my bio that would suggest, and I very often speak it, right, when I'm talking.
Yeah.
And so, there are pictures on LinkedIn, and sometimes you can see that someone has dark skin or that they're associated with a particular organization, might not be their employer, but a professional organization or a sports organization or something. And so you can infer that they are a person who has, as we say here, from an underrepresented background.
In terms of candidates that you've dealt with that had potential to be at a more senior level and were competing with other candidates that already had the experience at that more senior level, how can you best present yourself as a worthy candidate if you are going up in your career from, job to job, and you're may still be have that lack of confidence that you
Mm,
can get up a more senior role. I'll give you some examples. Sometimes I'm working, especially with women, and I say, okay, what's your 10-year goal?
yeah,
And they come to me and say, oh, my 10-year goal is to be a chief operating officer. And I go, why 10 years?
right.
Why not?
Why does it have to take that long?
I mean, I look at your experience,
Yeah.
compared to my male clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can be applying for COO jobs right now. Do you
Mm-hmm.
realize that? And I think people just don't understand that you can be hired for potential and you can
Of course.
advance in
Well,
your
and I don't even think it's necessarily potential. It might not show up by virtue of the title of the
career.
role that you're in, but you have probably demonstrated your abilities in other roles. That's why I keep talking about competencies because, see, I say that education doesn't make you smart and being smart doesn't make you competent, right? So, plenty of people who have big titles, big jobs, make lots of money, who are not that good at what they do, or at least they're not good at leading others, which is, as I said, typically what the expectation is when the higher up you go in an organization, your leadership potential. And yes, unless you were an individual contributor, it's your leadership that sets you apart, right? So I think the candidate needs to reshape their thinking around it. You also have to understand this is not, I've not worked anywhere that's been a perfect meritocracy. Relationships matter, right? And men are good at this. I will give them credit. They're going to talk to their buddy and say, hey, I want to check out that job. Will you put in a good word? The hiring manager, put in a good word for me. And I think women are much more, well, it says that I need this and this and this and this. I don't have those things yet, so I'm not going to apply. Men are like, I got 50% of it. I'm good here. I'm going after it.
Yeah.
And but the relationships that you develop and cultivate, and I'm not suggesting that these are nefarious or scandalous kinds of I'm just saying you need people who can vouch for you. You need friends and sponsors and mentors who can say something good about you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to tell them that you need them to say those things on your behalf. So
Mhm.
don't be shy. I know in a lot of cultures, it's self-promotion is taboo, but there are ways that it's not considered to be obnoxious or showy. You just have to tell people, look, I'm really interested in this role. What do you think? Do you know anybody who might be able to help me get considered? That's what you're going for. And once you're considered, once you're a candidate, you will have practiced, you will have rehearsed your comments, you will have built that narrative, and you'll go in confident and kill it. That's how you do it. But just to sit back and wait and hope that your resume gets picked, it's not that straightforward. It just isn't.
Yeah. Absolutely. How many times do we have to say that?
That was my son
As
calling
long as it
me.
takes.
Yeah, he's 26 and he's in the entertainment world and I have to remind him of the same thing. He's working for worked for some great companies, but I still have to remind him, you got to learn how to play the game. It isn't just about showing up for work every day and doing a great job. It's
Yeah.
building relationships with people. It's going out of your way sometimes and doing that extra thing, right? It's
Yeah.
having relationships outside of the company, being a part of professional associations. So you build a reputation that way, right? These are things that people don't seem to understand. If you want to move up, then you have to be, sort of a citizen of your community, not just at work. So it doesn't have to be hard. You have to want to enjoy it or stay in what you're doing. If you're comfortable in your little space, then stay there. But if you have aspirations for more, your world needs to expand.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the fact that today, because of technology, there are so many different ways that you can connect.
Of
There
course.
could be a way that suits your personality and, the how you feel most comfortable. It doesn't have to be face to face. You can write, you can do a video,
You
you
sure
can,
can.
there's so many different ways. So
Yeah. For all those introverts, right?
yeah,
Who are just cringing at what I just described. No, a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about is virtual. You reach out to people and I watch my son do this. It's like, yes, he's been watching me. You reach out to folks, not when you're looking for a job, when you just want to learn more. He reached out to some someone who had a similar title as he has at Netflix.
Mhm.
And I'm like, perfect. He said, I just wanted her to know what I do and where I work and, compare. And she was fine with that. Well,
Oh,
don't you know that she might think of him when there's an opening for someone at his level?
oh, lovely.
That's how that works.
Exactly, Jenny. Oh, it was so lovely to talk to you. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners? Final words, words of wisdom, where to find you?
Yeah, just I guess a word of wisdom. I'm big on passion and people doing what they love. I know it sounds trite, especially these days, but check yourself from time to time. Every 2 or 3 years, take an inventory of where you are and is your work filling you? Because there's nothing worse. There's no slower death than you just, grinding it out every day. You didn't come here to suffer. So find work that holds meaning for you, that's fun in some way. That's really important. And I think there's room for that even in these really curious times that we find ourselves in. So please do that. You can find me at ginnyclarke.com, GINNYCLARKE.com. And that's where my podcast, my speaking, all the stuff that I love to talk about and do is all there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your time. I really appreciate you being here with us.
Enjoyed it.
We have loved making this episode for you, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you for your support this year, especially if you are a newsletter subscriber and a regular listener to this podcast. If you have not yet subscribed to my newsletter for the job hunters and career enthusiasts, please go to my website renatabernardi.com or follow the link available in the episode show notes. And if you need extra support during the festive season, you can find on my website an online course called Reset Your Career and also a talent assessment called Find My Talents. They are always available and ready for you when you're ready for them. Ciao for now, and I'll see you next time.